the Zero Project Conference. We are a partner channel for that conference, and so we're happy to be working with them to bring this issue and these leaders and experts to you. And it's also, this session today is part of an ongoing collaboration between my organization, G3ICT, and the European Disability Forum and Microsoft. And we've been over several months looking at the linkages between inclusion of people with disabilities there in Europe and the digital transformation of society, and how we can be using procurement in the purchasing of technology and deploying and using of technology to promote greater inclusion of persons with disabilities and not create barriers. Today, we're going to focus specifically on how we do that in education. So with that, I'd like to ask each of my partner organizations to say a few words. Catherine, would you like to go?
Thank you so much, James. And hello, everybody. My name is Catherine Nocton, and I'm speaking to you here from my room in Brussels. I'm the director of the European Disability Forum. We're an umbrella organization at the European level promoting the rights of persons with disabilities. We're really excited to be part of this event today. The right to access inclusive education is fundamental for all children. And it is especially children with disabilities are one of those groups of children who are often excluded from education throughout their whole lives. Additionally, public procurement is extremely important to us. It's the way the government purchases all of its products and services, and inclusive public procurement is fundamental across all sectors and especially education. So we're really happy to partner with you on this event today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Asa, our partner for Microsoft.
Thank you, James. It's Esa Kaunistila from Microsoft. I'm sitting in my study in Helsinki. First of all, I'd like to thank very much G3ICT and EDF for organizing such a timely and important event to ensure accessibility in public procurement. The Microsoft partnership with these two organizations is very long-lasting, and it's been very successful over the years. And it's wonderful that you're always ready to organize discussions like today's. It is probably now, rather than never, been more important to explore how the private sector can play a role in driving forwarding a more inclusive and accessible future. Today, we will discuss how to improve the digital transformation of education in Europe, and how to support the digital transformation for learners with disability, and the potential to ensure greater inclusion and accessibility in classrooms, which are all very important topics. The mission of Microsoft is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. Extends beyond our product and services to the approach to inclusion in everything we do, including ensuring that all learners can participate in and benefit from the transformation of education. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Asa and Catherine. And it really has been, I think, both an honor and really quite productive to be partnered with you on this set of issues around procurement and inclusive digital transformation of society. Before we get started with our speakers and discussants, I'd like to ask my colleague at G3ICT, Julia, to maybe step us through a few practices to make sure that the event is as comfortable and productive for you as possible.
Thank you, James. My name is Julia Sarviro. I am Senior Project Manager at G3ICT team. I am a white woman with short blonde hair, and I wear the violet dress today. This meeting is recorded, and it will be made available to the public after the session. We have closed captions available in English. You can switch them on live transcript button at your menu, or please check the chat for the link to the captions being broadcasted in the browser. You can also there at the browser reach out to auto-translated captions in French, German, and Spanish. There is also international sign language interpretation available, and you can pin the interpreters, their videos, by right-clicking on it. We ask the panelists to keep the microphones muted unless you are speaking. And to the participants, we would like to ask you to use the Q&A section if you would like to ask a question to one of the panelists. And of course, please feel free to use the chat if there are any technical issues. G3ICT team is here to help you to resolve those. And of course, we are going to have the Q&A session towards the end of this event today. If there are still any questions left or any comments you would like to share with G3ICT, EDF, Microsoft, please send them to info@smartcitiesforall.org. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. So we've divided this discussion today up into two sections. The first will really focus on what do we mean by the digital transformation of education. How do inclusion and accessibility relate to inclusion in the classroom, in the use of technology in the classroom? We've got three speakers, each with, I think, a really interesting perspective on this topic and lots of experience. And we'll start with Janet Looney, who will be presenting some of the research that she's helped to lead. And Janet, I have to say, every time I dig into this relatively recently released research that your organization has partnered on, I find more nuanced information that is really incredibly powerful and valuable. So please do, with all of our speakers, maybe a brief introduction, and then please jump right in.
Okay, thanks a lot. That's a very nice introduction to the presentation. So my name is Janet Looney. I am a white female in a burgundy jacket and white blouse today. And I'm sitting in my home office in Paris. I'm the director of the European Institute of Education and Social Policy. We work on international education policy from a lifelong learning perspective, and we are also the editors of the European Journal of Education. So this particular study, let me see, I'm going to share my screen. And okay, you should have the slideshow version now. This study was conducted with our partners at Equirus, and lead researchers were Maria Melstreet and Laurie Day, who couldn't be here today. So I'm carrying the flag for our collective work. So this is a study on digital inclusion. It was funded by the European Commission, and it was carried out between September 2020 and September 2021. The backdrop for the study was growing interest in and demand for evidence on the role of digital tools within education and in the context of rapid technological change. There's also a high policy interest and increasing policy interest in digital education with the launch of the Digital Education Action Plan and the Digital Education Hub, of course, which were planned before COVID and are now even more prominent. So I'll also mention, the fact that this was carried out during COVID, as it was having its first and full impact on education systems, really helped to bring the equity and inclusion dimension into focus. So the study objectives, the main objective of the study was to establish actual and potential role of digital technologies. In other words, what's currently happening and what should be happening. The methods used for the study included, and to meet the objectives outlined here, included an extensive literature review. And I'll mention that our view of inclusion was very broad, very inclusive. So it was learners with disabilities and access needs, migrant learners, and so on. We also included a mapping of the policy and implementation, which was conducted by country level experts with a good view of what's happening at the ground level. We identified case studies of good practices so we could delve into what is working and conducted Delphi interviews with a range of stakeholders so that we could get current insights and refine those for our final policy recommendations. The scope of the study included primary and secondary education and vet education, and it also had some attention to early childhood education and care. With the focus on inclusion, we were most concerned with populations of learners with additional needs. We were concerned with equity, both in terms of access to digital tools and platforms, but also quality, with attention to high quality outcomes for all. And that encompassed well-being, effective teaching and learning practices to support all learners, and overall learning environments. An important sub-theme was the importance of agency as sort of the oil in the machine. So by that, we mean digital tools mediated by the behaviors and interactions between stakeholders at all levels within the system. And I think what's important to emphasize here, because there's sometimes a misconception that classrooms are mediated by technology, and it's really the other way around. The technologies are mediated by the people who are using them. So the study outputs include a final compendium with case studies and a final report and executive summary with the conclusions, findings, and recommendations. I will put a link to these products in the chat when I'm done with this presentation. I'll also note that the compendium has not yet been published, but it should be on the site soon. This is a commissioned site, so they will post it as soon as all the necessary steps have been taken. So this really is hot off the press. That gives you an idea. Now, to get into some of the details, in terms of access, of course, our information access is a result of our mapping of the EU 27 member states, and it provided data pre-pandemic. So as you'll see here, it was a mixed picture. We found quite stark national and regional differences in the availability of digital tools and the integration of digital pedagogies within classrooms. Tech is generally, although not exclusively, more embedded at the secondary stage. It is less used at the primary level, and there's quite a bit of variation at early childhood education and care levels. And here, there's some controversy on whether young children should be using tech tools, although there are some good results, which we can talk about later. The country mapping also revealed a complex patchwork of policy initiatives that have driven access and availability for teaching and learning. They reflect different owners at a policy level, education, regional, and economic development strategies, and so on. It's really quite different across the member states. Also, we find that historically, the development of measures for learners experiencing disadvantage are often driven by special projects and EU funds. So they're not, they're targeted EU funds for special projects. So scalability can be an issue. And that the inclusion projects in digital education are not always in sync. So they may be not necessarily tech-oriented or vice versa. And so that partnership is not always there. So as I mentioned, we started this study in September 2020. So it really was in the early days of the first few months of COVID. But I also want to emphasize that it is not just a COVID study. We were able to capture emerging challenges and successes following the first wave of the pandemic, and how ministries, schools, parents, and carers and learners were responding to the measures in place. And importantly, how they all stood up to the stress test of the school's emergency remote learning stage and the rapid shift to distance learning. The Delphi consultation, so when we were able to speak with a wide range of stakeholders in a couple of different rounds, that took place in May and June 2021, and it followed the country mapping exercise. And that provided an opportunity to test some of the emerging findings with a wider group of stakeholders across Europe. And it was really a fast moving picture. What we found, and this is really in tune with what I've seen in various studies, is that the disruption really compounded inequalities, with the poorest outcomes of the emergency school, emergency remote learning, the poorest outcomes reading for low socioeconomic groups, ethnic and linguistic minorities, and special education needs learners and their families. However, there were a few silver linings in the crisis that challenged the status quo, and this is why, it's called disruption. It was a fresh impetus to policy and legislation regulating the use of digital technology within education. So it pushed digitalization up the agenda and the massification of digital education programs. It also incited some cross-sectoral partnerships and investments in infrastructure. It prompted targeted action on inclusion, with a large number of member states initiating or scaling up measures for learners with additional needs. And it created conditions for greater school and municipal autonomy, as they were really there problem solving in the instant. This was a precedent set during the crisis, and new professional networks and collaboration platforms were formed. We were able, all these different actions demonstrated the sustainable use of digital tools and practices that were developed during the COVID-19 pandemic and often beforehand, but then put to the test. As one of the examples of the case studies that we included, the School in a Suitcase. This, of course, was started before the pandemic, but it played a valuable role. So the School in a Suitcase in Romania was developed for rural schools where there are specific barriers related to the lack of access to appropriate ICTs, low opportunities for teachers to develop their digital competences, and a lack of availability and high quality digital learning resources. So with Vodafone, the Romania Foundation and the World Vision Romania Foundation, they brought together the free hardware and software in a suitcase, training for teachers to use the resources and a dedicated platform. It was rolled out across 11 municipalities with more than 5,000 digital lessons added. And a large majority of students were supported in schools, and they were able to access learning easily during the 2020 lockdowns. So it was a case where you can see that the earlier efforts and investments really played out in this disruptive emergency situation and created a real resilience in the system. So let me move on to quality after access. So really, to understand what happens in classrooms and when and why different types of technology integrated are and so on was an important focus of the study. A really key issue is it's not what tech you have, if it's the latest and the fanciest and so on, but it's really how you use it. We found that the knowledge base on what works and for whom is really patchy. And we don't have enough evidence on the efficacy of specific educational tools or methods, but we do have an emerging evidence base. Part of the reason for this state of affairs is that new tech is emerging very rapidly, but there's also a lack of controlled studies. There's need for more monitoring and evaluation of how tech is being used and how it's better defining learning and well-being outcomes. I'll also mention that because education is contingent, it's also used in different situations, and it's not always easy to translate the findings of one controlled study into another situation. Action research, however, can give insights on how to implement tech into classrooms, and also really importantly includes contextualized insights of teachers, because that is often missing from research studies. Oops, just to unpack the evidence a little bit more on what works for whom. What we found was that mobile and micro learning, gamification, and so on, more practical and visual approaches can be really motivating for certain learners who struggle with traditional pedagogies or are just not engaged with the classic classroom format of being lectured at with classic textbooks. The interaction is a positive. The research shows an improved focus time on tasks for learners with developmental and attention disorders. There's also some evidence that artificial intelligence can be useful for diagnostic assessments and detecting specific learner difficulties. Here, I'm going to insert a little bit of an editorial and note that artificial intelligence is new and changing all the time. and that it should always be used with teacher judgment in mind, that we can't offload our teaching needs and diagnosis to machines, but we can use them to augment what's happening and also catch learners who might fall through the cracks, especially in larger school systems. And then finally, virtual learning environments are very important, and they can create a different kind of learning experience than in a classroom with a lecture and so on and so forth. They're more interactive. They can lead to more rapid feedback, which is supporting formative assessment and the ability to adjust lessons in time so students don't fall behind. It can support collaborative platforms so that students are working together more and interacting and building stronger relationships, and also on Web 2.0 platforms, engaging in creative products and using multimedia. And that also fosters a peer learning culture. So it's not all about getting information from the teacher, but learners also interacting and having their own agency supported. Another example here that we found in our research on good practice case studies was telepresence robots for learners with long-term illnesses. And this was, I think this exists in more places than Denmark, but this is the one that we identified there. So in this case study example, a robot was placed in the classroom as an avatar for students who couldn't attend the classroom. There's a two-way audio and a one-way camera, and the learner was able to see the classmates. So unlike distance learning where everyone's on the screen, here you just have the robot and it can move through the class and interact with students and have different viewpoints. Some of the evaluations found that the students were interacting with the avatar, and even stroking its cheek and playing with it at recess time, and really interacting. And of course, this also happened because they had a previous relationship. But there were some really meaningful social interactions, which is an extremely important goal for learning continuity and social emotional well-being.
Excuse me, Janet. If we probably need to wrap up this part of the segment in just a few minutes, if you could. Sorry to interrupt, but because this is incredibly rich information.
Yeah, I only have 2 more slides actually,
Great.
So I think we should be right on time. Okay, so digital learning environments create opportunities and risks in unexpected ways. So we found that some groups that are traditionally at risk of underachievement and exclusion can fare considerably better with their digital skills. And this includes low socioeconomic status learners, migrant learners, and other groups where the risk of marginalization is high. Other groups have some more risks, and those include individuals with cognitive disabilities who are victims of online bullying, impulsivity, and other problems, difficulty in navigating online. And finally, we found that there are some ongoing barriers in terms of gender and so on, and those need to be addressed in order to reduce disparities. And finally, key reflections. So this is of course a policy document, and we had some reflections related to policy. Factors that were critical to the success of digital inclusion in member states and mobilizing and maintaining access to digital clues included clear system leadership with broad and inclusive governance arrangements, infrastructural, information and pedagogical measures, and long-term budgets and plans. Smart use of data and feedback to iterate change, so a formative evaluation approach, and pedagogical activation. So again, noting that it's the most important aspect is that these are used and useful for teachers, and they are not just technologies that are brought into school and never used. So in conclusion, just to say, it's not just what tech you've got, but what you do with it that counts. And that is everything. So I'll post the link to the study, and of course I'll stick around for questions later in the afternoon. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Janet. As I said, this research is incredibly rich. Please do check out the links that Janet will post and continue to ask questions in the Q&A section. And Janet, I really appreciate how the pandemic wasn't the focus of the study, but you used it as an opportunity to identify some kind of unique observations. And I also really like how you looked at technology broadly, from mainstream technologies to more leading edge technologies and data as well. And so, as I said, every time I go back to the research, I find some new learnings that are really informative for me in my work. Well,
thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to share.
Absolutely. With that, I'd like to ask Humberto to introduce himself and give us his remarks.
Great. Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here. And we're talking about education, inclusive education for learners with disabilities is a crucial issue. The quality of education we offer young people will very likely determine their path in life and the opportunities they have as they grow older. It's also understandably quite a sensitive issue. It's because education is something very personal, and the best approach depends on each individual. We saw the education is not equal. I would like to remark some issues about education. Education there is no one size fits all solution to offer inclusive education. And we do not have the same financial aid in everywhere for the inclusive education. We also know that persons with disabilities front very barriers in their different settings at home or at schools. We need to have the research about projects for an inclusive education. We need to advocate for more funding for inclusive education projects. These funds need to focus on the necessities of every person in every country and every settings. Sometimes people didn't know about how to approach the very necessities of people. And the last, it's not only about the funding, but about the barriers of political issues, the public policies for people with disabilities. We, as the European Disability Forum, want to strengthen the necessity for educational inclusion, inclusive inclusion for families, children, and the person with disabilities in every setting, for an open education settings. And the quality of education is very important. I would like to highlight the importance of equity education for every person, and to have the same curriculum as their peers. The importance of being included in mainstream education settings is the feeling of being fully part of the community and the visible to those around you rather than being hidden away. Even if a child with a learning disability, for example, does not complete the same curriculum as their peers in the same school, the fact of attending the same physical educational institution can be hugely symbolic. It's also installed from a young age, a respect among all young people in the community for the diversity of our societies and the worth of every person while embracing our difference. You know, they are embracing their education, but they have, or the people with disabilities, we do have a lot of barriers. They do not have sign language interpreters. They do not have captioning in every meeting. And we are working for advocating to have these reasonable adjustments. As the UNCRPD say about inclusive education, the Article 24 of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities outlines the general principles of what inclusive education and in why it's necessarily. It sets out that states participants shall recognize the right of persons with disabilities to education by ensuring an inclusive education system at all levels in lifelong learning. It means that the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is responsible for monitoring and interpreting the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. There's a necessity to exchange the educational system and to recognize the difference for different learners at school and different times of the lifetime education. For no discrimination. The second, it's to have the learners at the same level with their peers, their families, to respect their very own contexts. The third is to have the reasonable accommodations, to not discriminate the people for not to have the reasonable accommodations, to respect their own context, to give them the reasonable accommodation based on their own necessities. We need to have the support plans and support policies for every person, for every learner, parting the individual needs from every person and their families, teaching their teachers at schools on how to improve their educations. This reasonable accommodation of educational settings should never be decided by a medical diagnosis of a child impaired, but instead must be decided by looking at the barriers of education that a particular child faces. This general support individual education plans should be designed for each learner with disability with their full involvement of their family and their teachers. What would we like to see the EU do to help support inclusive education? This is a tricky question, as education is famously one of the areas of policy where the member states and even the regions within each country retain full competence. However, there's still a lot of the European Union can do. One of the main tools that EU has up its sleeve is the distribution of the EU funds, particularly the European Social Fund Plus. We would like to see this money invested through the member states to train teachers and classroom assistants in involving learners with disabilities in mainstream settings. We will also like money to go towards hiring more classroom assistants to offer personalized support to learners with disabilities in the classroom. Money should also go towards the provision of necessarily assistive technologies such as screen readers or braille browsers to enable learners with disabilities to study autonomously, as well as for providing for more sign language interpreters in school to allow deaf or hard of hearing children to learn and communicate in their first language. Last but not least, finally, the EU is looking increasingly at the digital education, particularly through this European pillar of a social rights of action plan. We would like to all work on digital education and e-learning to prioritize setting standards for accessibility to reduce the ongoing risk of learners with disabilities having their education disrupted for health due to accessibility issues. We also like to see the member states of the COVID-19 resilience. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Umberto, and thank you for really sharing with us the EDF perspective, both on where we are today when it comes to inclusion in classrooms in Europe, but also the path forward and where we need to be headed. We appreciate that. And please do, for Umberto and the other speakers, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section. Next up is Ivana. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ivana Juraga, and I'm a policy officer at the European Commission in the Digital Education Department. So I think my presentation will follow quite nicely from Umberto's. I will just share my screen. I hope you can see my presentation well now. It's my pleasure to be here with you today, and I will focus briefly on some of the strategy making that we have at the European Commission around digital education and how it connects to inclusive education as well. So just as a way of introduction, we know that during the COVID pandemic, there was a large-scale shift to distance and online learning across the world. We had 1.6 billion learners in more than 190 countries out of school, and this transition has been far from simple. So we all had to switch to using distance learning practically overnight. And this revealed many opportunities. It promoted digital education around the world the way it had never been seen before, but it also brought significant challenges, especially in terms of equity and quality, as has already been mentioned. To assess how this experience went, the European Commission ran an open public consultation in the summer of 2020, and it was really very successful with more than 2,700 contributions from around Europe, and the majority of those being from individuals, so from teachers and teaching staff, parents, and learners themselves. What we learned from this consultation is that there were significant challenges, especially when it comes to learners with disabilities or special needs, as not all tools and content were accessible, and learners faced particular challenges on accessing technology and assistive technology as well, and having technical support provided to students with disabilities, as well as struggling with the teacher competence on disability and accessibility matters. As a result of this public consultation, and in order to push forward the digital education in Europe, the Commission and the EU as a whole adopted a digital education action plan called Resetting Education and Training for the Digital Age. The focus of this action plan are two strategic priorities. So it has two main focuses, one of which, the first one being fostering the development of a high-performing digital education ecosystem. So here we talk about setting up the conditions that education and training institutions need in order to provide digital education. So things like proper technological equipment, connectivity in schools, but also training of teachers and teaching staff, and having institutional strategies for digitalization of the pedagogical process. The second strategic priority is enhancing the digital skills and competences of the population as a whole. So not only those who are in formal education at the moment, but also adult populations, people who are already in employment but need to enhance their digital skills, and so on. The key characteristics of this action plan is that it promotes deeper cooperation across borders, sectors, and cultures. It is set specifically for the period from 2021 to 2027 in order to be in line with the EU programming and funding cycle. And it takes, like I said already, a lifelong learning approach. So it covers not only formal, but also non-formal and informal education. And the idea is to support it through cooperation, good practice exchanges, as well as collecting evidence, peer learning, and research. Now, when it comes to learners with disabilities, this is an important target group that we cannot ignore, because at the moment we know there are around 87 million persons with some form of disability living in the EU. This includes the entire population, because importantly, everyone in the population is potentially a learner, regardless of what age they are. So we are not talking only about children in formal education. And we know that learners with disabilities face considerable barriers in access to education. When we talk about early school leaving or attaining a tertiary degree, finishing higher education, their rates are significantly behind the rates of people without disabilities. And this is obviously something that we want to work on in the future. Inclusion is really at the core of the Digital Education Action Plan, both when it comes to socioeconomic inequalities and when it comes to learners with special needs, because the guiding idea behind the Digital Education Action Plan is not to increase the digital divide, but rather to reduce it and to use digital technologies in the potential they have to make education more accessible and more equitable, rather than the other way around. So I have a slide here which shows all the different actions which are included in the action plan. I don't want to terrify you with this slide. I just wanted to give a short overview. One thing I would like to mention is just a few actions that directly have an impact on inclusion and accessibility. So one of these actions, for example, is the Council recommendation on online and distance learning, which was adopted last year. Which aims to portray a vision for primary and secondary education, to increase the inclusiveness and the flexibility of school education through the use of digital technologies. We also have actions which encourage member states to make the most of the available EU funding with regard to both internet access, but also the purchase of digital equipment and e-learning applications and platforms, and in particular for students from disadvantaged groups and students and educators with disabilities. So this is the kind of funding that Umberto was mentioning in his talk as well. We also have recently launched an action that I would just like to spend another moment on, and this is the structured dialogue on digital education and skills. This is a new action that we started towards the end of last year with the objective of supporting the EU member states in the digital transformation of their education and training systems in an integrated, coherent, and more ambitious approach. The way we are doing this is by engaging in a dialogue which brings together different sectors of governments. So not only the education ministries, but also talking to ministries responsible for the digital transition, ministries responsible for financing, for infrastructure, for employment and social policies, and so on, and at the same time bringing to the table the business sector, the social partners, and the civil society. This is a process that we will be engaging in over the next 12 months until the end of 2022. And we will have two important outcomes of this process, proposals for two council recommendations at EU level, one of which will be on the enabling factors for digital education. What we call enabling factors are basically building blocks that each education and training system needs to have in order to be able to provide high quality and inclusive education and training to their learners. And among these enabling factors, one of the crucial ones is also access to assistive technology for students who need it, and also making technology used in the classrooms accessible to all learners. So this is something that we will be working on over the next 12 months, and we hope to have good results by the end of the year. And so with that, thank you very much. Our contact details are here on the last slide, and I believe the presentations will be shared. If you have any questions, I will be around until the end of the seminar. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ivana. And yes, we will be sharing making all of the materials available through G3ICT and our partners. Ivana, thank you for sharing those insights from the consultation, but also speaking a bit to the new opportunity to weigh in on these issues of inclusion and digital transformation of classrooms through the upcoming dialogue, which is great, a great opportunity. So we've heard a little bit from the first three speakers about the digital transformation of schools, the impact on learners with disabilities, and the opportunities for learners with disabilities. Next, we really want to make that linkage to procurement and how schools, education ministries are enormous consumers of technology. They have a lot to say about the kind of technology that they want to buy and deploy in classrooms across Europe and really around the world as well. And so first up, speaking to these issues of procurement and promoting greater inclusion and accessibility in classrooms will be Ima. Ima, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Ima Placencia. I also work in the European Commission, but in another department. My unit is responsible for the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the new Disability Strategy 2021-2030, and accessibility legislation. And that is where I'm going to be talking to you about it today, to complement the presentation that my colleague did on what we are doing on digital education. So focusing on accessibility and procurement. Let me start by saying that we have legislation in Europe that requires basically buying accessible. So when public authorities buy educational material, books, technological solutions, computers, electronic systems for teaching, as long as those fall under the European legislation, they will have to be bought. They will have to be required to be accessible by the public authorities. So this is a very important issue. We're covering or considering these technologies used by public authorities. In addition, let me say that our recently or approved in 2019 legislation called the European Accessibility Act contains additional obligations that would be really very relevant, are very relevant for the educational system, the digital education settings to be accessible. The European Accessibility Act requires that economic operators, manufacturers, service providers place in the market accessible technologies from 2025. Many of these accessible technology is used in education, both in classrooms, but also in remote education. I think that should the Act would have been already applicable, the experience for learners with disabilities during this pandemic would have been really very different, because we are talking about having tools like computers and telephones. We're talking about having electronic communications, audiovisual, technology that supports audiovisual or gives access to audiovisual media services. We're talking about electronic books that would have to be accessible. The application date of this legislation is 2025. So we are still in the preparatory phase, in which we are doing two basic steps. First, we are working with the member states so that they translate basically that, or as we say, they transpose this European legislation into national laws. And that process ends in June this year. Then national laws would have to be adopted. Then we have a period until 2025 in which our main work is going to be to support the implementation of the directive by the economic operators, but also public authorities and governments. There is where we are doing a number of things. First, the development, we are calling for the development of European harmonized standards. These would be standards that would support and further elaborate, more in technical terms, the accessibility requirements that are in the legislation, in the European Accessibility Act. We have in that legislation one annex that contains a set of accessibility requirements, and the standards will further elaborate so that it is easier to know how to implement those requirements in practice. In addition, and this is the second point, how we are supporting implementation, we are launching a resource center for accessibility. That resource center is announced in the Disability Strategy 2021-2030. And the aim is really to support implementation of accessibility, to bring coherence across the EU, to enhance competence and to facilitate the process of making accessibility. We are working on its preparation, and I hope that by the end of this year we will have more information. So how this links with the procurement legislation that I started with, saying that the obligation exists to buy accessible, is that the European Accessibility Act contains provisions that indicate that in the context of procurement, the accessibility requirements for the products and services in its scope, and please remember that it was, goods like computers, telephones, e-book and services like electronic books, for example. The Accessibility Act puts concrete accessibility, functional accessibility requirements. In other words, it renders operational the general accessibility obligation that is in the public procurement directives. To support the application or the knowledge about how to buy accessible, among other elements, I would like to refer you to a guide that we have published last year. The guide is called Buying Social, and it contains a whole section on buying accessible, and with links to and references to the European standards. To finish, let me also say that we have carried out a study on how disability inclusiveness and accessibility has been taken on board or is being taken on board on plans for the digital transformation. My colleague mentioned these digital transformation plans in the area of education, but this goes beyond that. We today, with the recovery plans, with the recovery funds, there is a lot of investments going on investing in digital transformation. Well, the conclusions of this, or the findings of this study, is that very, very, very few digital plans across all member states consider disability inclusiveness or even accessibility of that technology that is going to be deployed. Similarly, and this is, I would say, also of concern, is that accessibility strategies, disability strategies, disability plans, few also of them have elaborated sections on digital accessibility or digital inclusion in relation to persons with disabilities. So to close, just to say that, okay, this gives us a big feeling. I think we are investing a lot on improving accessibility, or improving accessibility with a great potential for digital education. And to have digital tools that are accessible and inclusive for persons with disabilities. But the reality is that we are still far away from having reached a truly inclusive digital environments for the education of persons, providing access to education for persons with disabilities. So thank you for your attention.
Ima, thank you so much for those remarks and for laying out the policy framework that really, I think, supports improving accessibility and inclusion in all sectors, but certainly in education there in Europe. And I know, you know, that at G3ICT, our nonprofit points to many of these policies and standards around in our work around the world as excellent practices to model. And I like that you sort of asked the question of, if the European Accessibility Act were fully in place today and implemented, how would education look differently today and be more inclusive, which I think is an interesting and important question. Thank you. So next up is Susanna. Susanna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. So hello, everyone, and thank you, James. My name is Susanna Loren. I'm the Chief Research and Innovation Officer at a consultancy company called Funka. I'm also the representative to the EU for G3ICT and IAAP. And I'm also currently the chair of the joint working group working with the standards that Ima was talking about, that supports the directives on accessibility in the European Union. So James asked me to be efficient so that we can save a little time, so I'll try to be short. I've been asked to talk about good practices, challenges, and opportunities for improvement when it comes to procurement of accessibility. And I think we all agree that procurement is kind of one of the keys, or maybe the key to better inclusion, but still it's not really used as much as it should or could. And we have just recently finalized a couple of research projects, or a series of research projects in the educational area on this in Scandinavia. And it's really clear that procurement is not used the way it could have been done. And I think it has even more focus now with the pandemic and everything, that really digitalization in the educational system is not really working for everyone. So I really think that the EU is the driver here with the directives and the standards. And the procurement directive may have not made a big change, but still we saw in our numbers already when the procurement directive came out that that ICT companies on the supply side started to feel that there was a little bit more focus on these things. And with the Web Accessibility Directive, things are changing really. And of course, with the European Accessibility Act, I agree with Ima. I think a lot more will happen. So things are going in the right direction. But as far as I can see from our research, the two main challenges in general is, I mean, apart from people not being aware of the topic at all, is that the procurers are not accessibility experts. And sometimes the community tries to treat them as such. And I think that is not going to work. And the other big challenge I see is that sometimes in procurement, the aspect of quality is not considered enough. So when it comes to procurers not being accessibility experts, that's kind of, they're specialists in procurement, and that is a specialty in itself. And they need to be able to procure everything or anything. So we can't really expect them to be experts in our topic, even if that is close at heart. So there is a need for awareness, of course, and tools and support. And I'll get back to the tools and support. But I think one interesting finding that we have found is really that there's a need of collaboration. There is kind of an organizational issue here. So in many cases, there are accessibility knowledgeable people in the organization, but the people responsible for accessibility and the people responsible for procurement, they don't really speak to each other, or not in a good way, at least. So, and sometimes we even see that the communication or IT people who know about accessibility, they seem a little bit scared maybe for the procurement department or the legal people. So I think if organizations would better use the competence and experience that they already have in the organization, I mean, the people who kind of get their hands dirty and are close to the action, that would really be a good practice to do. And we see that when that happens, it really helps the organization to become more accessible at the general level. And this is not only for the educational system, but in all procurement, of course. And when it comes to the quality aspect, we see some organizations using the same kind of simple procurement templates and models for procurement when they procure educational systems or material, as they do when they buy paper for the copy machines, something like that. And really, then price will be the only award criteria, or at least the decisive factor, and that just won't work, of course. And this happens, of course, because of lack of awareness. But I do think that the procurers, even the ones who do know about the topic and care about it, they are kind of led in the wrong direction by the technical specifications. Some people claim that accessibility is a yes, no, black or white question, and kind of a setup where you can tick the box, you can say, yes, we are accessible, and then that's kind of it. Because the supplier will always claim to be compliant with any technical standard. But as all of we know, that accessibility is really about humans, and the context, the situation, the devices, and many other aspects are just as important to take into account as the technical standard. So how is the learning material going to be used? Is it part of a learning management system, or is it standalone or part of another system? Is it used on desktop or mobile? Can the interface be configured to fit my needs, or can I use my own assistive technology together with it, etc., etc. So it is a little bit more complicated than just ticking a box. So if we move on to the best practices, I think that the best practices that we have found is really when accessibility becomes the new normal, if you like. So when accessibility is treated as the daily routine. So when I prepare a meeting, I create the agenda, I make sure that there's coffee, and I call the captionist and the sign language interpreter. So that way I know that my meeting will run smoothly. Something like that. Easy checklists that makes it part of what you always do. When accessibility becomes that mainstreamed, then it starts working for real. And this is true for public sector bodies, but also for large organizations that kind of put this into their processes, and it does work. So when they procure or buy things, they need to put in, they have a set of general requirements, like the supplier needs to deliver on time, they shouldn't use child labor, or they should be environmental friendly, or keep budget, or whatever, some standard things. And if you put accessibility in there at the same level as all of these other things, then things start happening. And really, the organizations that succeed most in accessibility procurement, they don't stop there. They also include the same things in the contract, so that the supplier is not being paid in full if the accessibility requirements are not met. And that means that they also need to control what is delivered to them. So I believe that there needs to be a policy decision at the management level and a practical kind of hands-on way of working with accessibility, because nice words will not do the trick, and one single committed professional is not enough either. So you need to have kind of everyone on board to succeed with this, but specifically make sure that there's a collaboration between procurers and subject matter experts. So a little bit about the opportunities and some useful tools. I wanted to be a little bit future leaning. So in the US, probably most of you know that there's something called the VPAT, the Voluntary Product Accessibility Templates. They have been around for a while, a lot of debate, pros and cons about that, but it is right now being refined and redefined, I think, in a very interesting initiative called the Open ACR, so Open Accessibility Conformance Reports, funded by the GSA, the General Services Administration, which is the federal agency for procurement and ICT services and administration for other agencies at the federal level in the US. So this is a way to try to make the new generation of VPATs more useful. And I personally think that this could be really, really useful for the EU, and myself and many others have tried to push for this, and so far we have had very little interest, but I still hope that someone will look into this, because I really think it could be a good opportunity for the EU. But what we already have here is the EN 301549 and other European standards. So, and I really want to promote the EN standard, and I am biased here. It's kind of not only mine, but many other also see the EN standard as our baby. But I do think that the Annex B of this standard, I know it's long, it's complex, it's difficult, technical standards are hard, but the Annex B is really a useful tool, and it is used a lot by procurers all around the world, not only in Europe. It can support procurers both when choosing the right requirements used in procurement, and also for selecting the best solution for the supplier. Actually, Annex B could be useful for developers and designers as well, but we have much less data on that, so I can't tell you if that is happening or not. Another useful tool, of course, that helps both buyers and sellers is professional certification. And now I'm not talking about certifying a product, but certifying the staff at the supplier side. Because when you procure something that doesn't exist yet as a website or an app, then you are not really looking for a product, you're looking for a partner. And then you need to know that this partner has the competence that you need. And the International Association of Accessibility Profession, which is the one of the parts of G3ICT, we are providing professional certification that is used both in recruitment and procurement. So we see an increasing number of member states using it, not yet as a mandatory requirement, but as an award criteria. And in some member states, there is a need for more formal approval. So I hope that the Commission will push for certification, either IAAP certification or something else. But there is a need for procurers to be able to distinguish people who claim to know accessibility and those who actually do know the topic. So just to summarize this, cooperation is important. See accessibility as a quality aspect of every activity you do, and make sure that when you procure, have clear requirements, look for proof for competence, and control that your delivery is accessible when you get it. Thank you.
Susanna, thank you very much. And I know, and maybe a lot of our guests here and participants know that you've been incredibly active in Europe, but also worldwide on both policy and standards. And I think it's important that you make that linkage between sort of high-level policy and standards to actual implementation and best practices, good practices, tools, and resources. And we actually at G3ICT have an entire web portal on procurement and accessibility and inclusion, and maybe Julia or Bella can post that into the chat as well. And you can find some of those tools and resources there. So next up is Caroline Wright. Caroline, would you like to introduce yourself?
Lovely. Thank you very much, James. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you should be able to see that now. Is that okay? Lovely. I will kick off. I know we're a little bit tight for time. So let me go to the start. I'm Caroline Wright. I'm Director General of the British Educational Suppliers Association. We work with the British, the United Kingdom's education suppliers. So that's everybody from companies that make textbooks to edtech to educational furniture, and in particular, the members I'm going to talk about today, the companies that specialise in special education needs products. We work with them to raise awareness of their products and services, and also to help them drive up the quality and standards of what they offer, which in turn we hope drives up standards of education across the globe. We carry out market research, we carry out conversations with governments, and take our members around the world to share their expertise and knowledge at various exhibitions and with government conversations. We estimate around 80% of the value of the UK education market in our membership, but really importantly, we'll never represent sort of 100% of the education companies in the UK, precisely because of this slide. We ask our companies to comply. They have to comply with our code of practice. And our code of practice it's aimed so that schools and colleges and users can buy from trusted quality suppliers. So it covers things like quality and standards, integrity, customer service, transparency and openness, safeguarding and data security, and following all of the laws and legislation within the countries and regions which they're operating in. And also, really importantly, that you can see there's a point about discriminatory conduct. So that's our general code of practice, which all of our companies sign up to, as well as us carrying out financial checks on them and asking them to provide case studies of how they've worked in the education system for a period of time. That's our general principles. I'm going to come on in a little bit to some specific work we've done on inclusivity and diversity, which touches upon disability. But now there are many more, but just some of these companies will bring it to life, because like I say, we cover all education products and services, but a specific number of our members are specialised in special education needs. And what's really unique about many of these companies is very often they have been founded by a teacher or somebody with personal experience of working with learners with disabilities and additional and extra education needs. And they're really dedicated. They're often very small companies, but are really specialised and dedicated to a particular disability or particular way of helping support their students. So, you know, there are many more companies, but just so that it brings it to life, so you can see some of the members that we work with. Now, actually, because they're very small, there are, I'm going to come on to some of the factors of how governments can help in their procurement to make sure that those small specialist expert companies can really share their expertise with schools and teachers and learners. But first of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how, as an association ourselves, we have really been trying to, and it's a journey where it's never good enough and there's always more we can do, but as part of our journey of making sure that we reflect inclusion and diversity in the products and services that our members make and produce and work with schools. It really started out of actually the Black Lives Matter movement, but in 2021, our educational curriculum resource and tactile resources producers came together and said, we would really like to see if we can agree and work on some industry principles of diversity and inclusion, and that being more general at this stage, covering race, sexual orientation, disability and all aspects of diversity inclusion, just to make sure what we produce and make is more reflective of our audiences and users. So they produced a number of principles that touch on their intentions of what they're seeking to do, which is to learn from and work with all communities to reflect the communities we are producing materials for, the content itself to make sure that it represents different voices and different lived experiences, and our ways of working as an industry to make sure that a wider range of people have the opportunities to succeed in working in the industries that we represent. So we published our industry principles of diversity and inclusion, and they're on our website for anybody to see, in addition to our code of practice. but actually in terms of the special needs companies that we work with as well, we want to be able to share their expertise and their learnings of working within the UK system internationally more. And we work with the British government on taking those companies out to education events internationally as part of our international education strategy. And we have also just agreed, now this is very much the start of work in progress, but to actually start to review that code of practice that I shared with you earlier from a very specific diversity and inclusion perspective. We have principles that our publishers follow, but actually should we be looking at making sure that we include a wider amount of accessibility and diversity and disability perspective in our code of conduct. So that's what we're doing as an organisation. But in terms, I know we have lots of governmental organisations here on this call, and just some thoughts from a trade association perspective representing the companies that will go and bid for some of the government contracts. What we see, I'd really say in our experience, to help the learners with disabilities, what will really help with governments in their own procurements is just making sure that any frameworks that a government introduces, or a local governmental organisation, is having the flexibility to adapt to learner needs. In the United Kingdom, with the Scottish government 4 or 5 years ago, we had a huge issue that, with all of the best intentions, the Scottish government has a very, very specific framework in place for the procurement of curriculum resources in classes. It guides teachers in order, rightly, to make the best use of public funding, to choose from a list that has been approved and are very high quality products. But when we're talking with students with a vast range of different disabilities, some of which aren't yet diagnosed, that list was prohibitive in the sense of being able to provide the support for the very, very wide range of needs. And we had an example of one teacher in Scotland who knew a product from one of our members that would have really helped that particular child with their special education need. And it took them more than a year that they were in that key stage within their education to get approval to buy that particular resource to help them. You know, we shouldn't have a situation where any child has to wait more than a year of their learning before they get the help that they need. So really just have that. It's great to think about public funding and to make savings where you can, but make sure that it's not so prescriptive that it stops learners having access to the resources that they need. The second point I wanted to make is make sure that any framework that you have or route to procurement allows schools and learners to be able to trial the products before they commit. We have introduced a service called on there, lended.org.uk, that specifically allows schools to take out trials of a particular learning resource, so they can try it with their own individual students to check that it would work in their context. And we deliberately did that after seeing a service that one of the London boroughs offers, a special needs library that they can go and take out a resource and try it in their school. We have now introduced a nationwide electronic version of that for the services that our members offer, and that can save huge amounts of money and also make sure that schools get exactly the product that they need to help support their learners with disabilities. I'd also say that make sure that technical specifications allow for the adaptation and flexibility that individual learners will need. You know, one size does not fit all. There is multi-pace learning that's needed, and making sure that any specifications reflects that. And then also not being so prescriptive of following all of the guidance that we might as large organisations follow, and allowing flexibility so that learners with special needs and disabilities can explore an inclusive way of learning and employment. I just point anybody to the National Star College in Great Britain that really leads the way in terms of work-based training in the college for their young people, with a bistro and a printing, a print and design centre. It's just wonderful to see, and that's been done with a very hands-on and flexible approach to helping support individual students with additional needs. And then from the employer perspective, as I mentioned, many of the companies that work in the field of special education needs are by their nature very, very small, sometimes with very large governmental frameworks and procurement that can unintentionally be prohibitively difficult for small companies to be able to bid for larger contracts. So being very aware of making sure that tender timescales are clear and lengthy so that you can enable wider participation, making sure that obviously for a range of reasons, making sure documentation's in a wide range of formats and any engagement events that you hold are accessible. So that's my tips really to the audience who are listening. I hope it's helpful. Here are my details, and thank you very much. I've enjoyed today.
Caroline, thank you so much for some really very practical advice and guidance. I think in the work that G3ICT does around the world on digital inclusion and accessibility, we always try to work with governments, with disability advocacy organizations and member organizations, but also with industry, because quite literally your members are providing the solutions to greater and improved digital inclusion. And so we appreciate that perspective, and we'll get a bit more of that from our next speaker from Microsoft. Asa, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, James. It's Asa Kaunistula of Microsoft again. I'm very delighted to be here and talk about corporate perspective on procurement as a key to inclusive education. At Microsoft, we are passionate about creating products and services that help people with disabilities unlock their full potential, including at school. We are making investments across our business to enable this, and believe it is imperative for all organizations to create cultures of inclusion. Meeting the needs of all today's diverse learners and helping them build life skills has never been more important. Over the last 3 decades, we have learned that when technology is inclusive, we can connect people and information in incredible ways. But there is much more work to be done. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the potential of technology to change things for the better, and has also accelerated the prioritization of digital solutions and bringing with it a focus on accessibility as people leverage technologies in education and social interaction. However, remote learning and information sharing can be more difficult as digital content and platforms are not always accessible. At Microsoft, we set up several online training courses to empower students with inclusive learning tools and for teachers to create inclusive classrooms. One of the tools, for instance, help improve reading fluency and build literacy skills through personalized learning experiences with reading progress that enables independent reading practice and AI-assisted reviews. Another example I'd like to mention is a school in Kowanowsko in Poland, which has introduced a set of accessibility tools built into Office 365, from digital whiteboards to stickers, add-ons. And this is all to accommodate the different needs of its primary and secondary level students who experience varying degrees of emotional, intellectual, and physical disabilities. In the words of one of the teachers at the school, in our work, we build on students' strengths. We motivate children to learn and foster their self-esteem. In this context, we believe governments, including the education organizations, have a very important role to play in improving inclusion by ensuring they purchase, develop, and use accessible information and communications technology to better support citizens, including learners and the education sector. When governments buy and develop accessible technology, it not only creates access to education and services for citizens and employees, it drives more innovative and accessible technology into the marketplace, which benefits everybody. Accessibility regulation and policies can be very powerful vehicles for helping organizations promote best practices for increasing accessibility and inclusion. Policies that require organizations to buy and develop accessible technologies not only help those organizations to maximize the hiring of people with disabilities, but also make it easier for citizens to access products and services. We believe that by incorporating accessibility criteria, such as EN Standard 301-549, into procurement policies and requirements, governments can create economic incentives for businesses to invest in innovating more accessible products. The ultimate goal is to stimulate competition for better accessibility, to provide equal participation for people with disabilities, and to help achieve digital inclusion objectives, and fulfilling eventually the implementation of UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, also known as UNCRPD. One thing is clear: to make this all happen, it is not enough to make commitment for people with disabilities. Those commitments need to involve the people with disabilities from day one. They have to be integrated in the process all through. People with disabilities are creating the future they want to see, and we encourage every other organization to proactively enable this through a lens to innovation and inclusion. The issue of accessibility is timeless, but the pandemic and the speed of the digital revolution, speeded up by the pandemic actually, have nevertheless exacerbated the disability divide, and with it, the urgency in doubling down the efforts to narrow the gap. We continually incorporate new learnings and are deepening our engagement with nonprofits and partners, helping them to use digital technology in order to become more accessible. Thank you very much.
Asa, thank you so much for those remarks. And I think it's sort of building on the remarks by Caroline as well. I think it's really exciting and important that the industry recognizes the importance of digital inclusion of persons with disabilities in general, but certainly in the education sector in particular. And so hearing that kind of commitment and really, I think the interest that we heard in your remarks of Microsoft, but of industry more broadly as well, I think interested in competing on innovation and accessibility of your products and services, and the role that governments can be playing across Europe in driving that innovation and competition, I think is really an exciting opportunity. And so I'm thrilled to hear that, certainly. So we're getting to the end of the 90 minutes for this discussion. Some of you have been putting questions in the chat, and I think our speakers have been answering and sharing resources. So thank you very much for that. I just want to close out the session by saying, I think we've heard today, and by design, we wanted to hear today from different perspectives on this topic of the digital transformation of education and what that means for learners with disabilities. We've heard from government, we've heard from disability organizations, from industry, from civil society, and I'm hoping that we are walking away with a more nuanced understanding of the current state of accessibility of classrooms across Europe and the world, and more importantly, I think the opportunity we have, including through procurement and standards, to make dramatic improvement to that. And certainly, our organization is thrilled to be partnering with EDF and Microsoft to drive that progress. My colleagues, Julia and Bella, have been sharing some resources. Julia, if you haven't shared already, we'll share an email. If you're interested in any of these materials, we'll be posting them on our website, but also can make them available to you through email. We will be following up this event on procurement and digital transformation with subsequent discussions in different areas with our partners, EDF and Microsoft, including inclusive workplaces and the role of procurement and inclusive COVID recovery in procurement. So we look forward to speaking with you more. Thank you to all of the speakers. Thank you to our partners at EDF and Microsoft, and thank you to all of you for participating and for your good questions and perspective. Have a good day.
Thanks.